Welcome back. So the last thing that we are going to learn in this section is how to programmatically create and fill arrays. So far we have always simply created like this one array. So let me just write console.log array of 1, 2, 3. So like this. So basically writing them out by hand literally. So maybe we might have done it like this also. So using a new array, a constructor. So let me just say console.log of new array of. So when we run this, see here we get the same output, and then passing in all the numbers here as an argument, and then also create this array. Now in this case, we basically already have all the data, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 7. So that's the data that we already have. So therefore, we could then manually create these arrays. However, we could also generate arrays programmatically. So without having to define all the items manually, and there are many situations in which it is necessary, and there are also multiple ways of doing it, and the easiest one is to again use array constructor function. So let's just create a new array here, then I'll pass only one argument, so which is the 7. So here let me just say create constant x equals to new array of 7 console.log x. So right now, what do you think here the output is going to be? So here it creates a new array with the 7 empty elements here, and in there it simply contains nothing. So this output is weird indeed, and the reason for that is that the weird behavior of the array function here. So which it does is to, whenever we only pass in one argument, then it creates a new empty argument with the length. So we don't know about this special particularly of this array constructor function, then this can lead to weird errors. Okay, now we cannot really use this array of anything. For example, we cannot call the map method on it to fill it up. For example, we wanted to do this map, and then in the each element. So here let me just say console.log x.map of. So here we are just setting this function to here 5. So here we simply might want to put something here like 5, which I did, and then you will see here it is the same thing happened. So nothing changed here. So the same output as before. So this is not really useful except for one thing, because there is one method that we can call on the empty array, that is the fill method. That's a new method that we haven't studied yet. It is a straightforward. So let me just show you this. So let me just turn this here off for now. So let me just write here x dot fill of 1, and then here console.log x. So when I run this, as you can see here, this x empty array here, it is just filled with the 1. So similarly, you can just put any random number here like 2 or anything like that. So here it gives the array of 2's for in this case. So let's now do more about the fill now. So it is similar to the splice method. So we'll just simply say x dot fill of for suppose let's just say starting variable. So here the content variable inside should be the 1, and then here it should start with the 3. For suppose let me just say, see here, our initially we are declaring here our value, and then from where it should start, from the third element in the array, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So here it starts. Okay, so and also we could say that just like this splice, we want to specify the end parameter. So for suppose let me just say here 5, then you can see here it is just set here only to the 1, and between 3 and 5, and this final index is not included in the array. Of course we can use the fill method on another arrays, so it doesn't have to be the empty array. So here let me just set this to the constant array. Now we can fill the array method. So let me just say here array dot fill of, we want to say here fill with the number 9. Let's start with the 3 and then end with the 7. Okay, and console.log array. As you can see here, so here we are setting our value here to be starting with value to be 9, and then here we just started in the array of 3 and then end here with the 7. So you see here our array. So here this one is going to be the empty array. So here it is going to be the empty arrays plus fill method, and then down here we have array.from, array.from. However, if we want to, so if we wanted to recreate the array from our first example here, this array of array, and we wanted this array to be recreated. So programmatically, well, for that we'll use this array.from function. Okay, and how do we use it? So this is something completely new, we didn't see this before. So here we are not using the from as the method on the array, instead we are using the array constructor. So that's why here it is the array dot from. So and this array here is exactly the same as this one, right? So we want this array, right? So and then on the function object we just call the from method, and that sounds confusing, but we'll make more sense of it in the object oriented programming section. But anyway, into this function here we can just pass in the object with the length property and set that to the 7. So here I am saying the length, and then here I am setting this into the 7, and then the second argument is a mapping function. So it's exactly like the callback function we passed into the map method. So let's start. So let's also programmatically recreate this array of 7 once. So let's write a callback function here. In this case we don't even need any arguments, but still we have to write a function. So let's write a arrow function here, which we simply return 1 in each iteration. No arguments, no current element, no current index, and nothing. So all we want to return is 1, and that will put 1 in each of the array position. So let me just write that. So here we'll just simply just say like this. So we'll just store this here in the variable constant y. Okay, here console.log. So here now when I run this, see here we just created like previously where we did here. Okay, and indeed we get the same exact result which we have done before, but in my opinion it is a lot cleaner than using the weird new array behavior than together with the fill method. So in my opinion this is the nicer way, but anyway let's now take it one step further, but let's actually create this initial array from 1 to 7. Okay, so let me just say for that here a constant of z equals to array dot from of, so array dot from length of length we are setting here to 7, and then like previously here we are using the current, and then here we are setting this into I plus 1. So here array dot from here the length of 7, and then our callback function, as always we get the current element. So let's call it the current first and then the current index. So the index will vary between the 0 and 6. So all we have to return from this function is I plus 1. So again this callback function here is exactly like the one in a map method. So you can simply imagine that you're using this as the callback function in the calling the map method on an empty array. So as always we get the current element and the index. So adding 1 to the index will give us the values from 1 to 7. So let me just console.log. this Z. See here, we got the value here between the 1 to 7. So remember how I used a variable like this. So I'm using here the underscore. So an underscore which means throw away the variable. So that is another use case for using the convention, because we do not need the current value at all. But still, of course, we have to define something at the first parameter, because the index that we need is the only the second parameter. But to denote that we are not using the current element, we simply write an underscore. Then the other programmers will also understand this convention and then automatically knows that we don't use this parameter. So this is how we create an array programmatically. Let's now move on and see more use case of array from function. And now this from array from function was initially introduced into JavaScript in order to create arrays from arrays like structures. So remember how I talked about so-called iterables before. So things like strings, maps, or sets, they are also iterables in JavaScript, and so they can be converted into real arrays using the arrays.from. And that's the reason also for the name of the function, because we can create arrays from the other things. All right, now beside these obvious literals that I just mentioned, like map or sets, another great example of array like structures is the result of using the query selector all. So maybe you remember the query selector all returns something like a node list, which is something like an array, which contains all the selected elements, but it's not a real array. So so it does not have methods like map, for example, it's not a real array. So it does not have most of the array methods like map or reduce. So if we actually need to use a real array method like that on a node list, we first need to convert that node list to an array, and for that array from is the perfect. So let's do something here now, and let's say that we don't have the movements or for application here stored in an array. So let me just show you the real quick. So let me log in here, and then so let's again pretend that we only have these values here. So all of these movements are only stored here in the user interface. We do not have them somewhere in our code. We don't have an array containing these values. So let's say we want to calculate their sum. So therefore we need to somehow get the first from the user interface and then do calculation based on that. So for that, here let me just write here the constant movements UI. So here I'm just setting this to array dot from of document dot query selector all of. So let me just show you that in our HTML document. See here, this one, this class, this movements value, here we are having this 4000 pound, and then here you are having this one, my negative 378, right? So we want to just copy this class from here. So we'll going back here, we'll just say dot and then paste. And then here let me just say console.log movements UI. Yeah, here two dots, right? So it is giving us error. See here, right now here we are having the only the first two elements, because by default in the starter file we are getting the only here the inputs here only two files, right? So we don't want here the only two, so we want for all of this. So how do we get that? So we want to get these all the for 8 movements. So we need to add an event listener to this balance value here as well. So here let me just say label balance dot add event listener of click, and then here the function of. So here we need to get these 8 movements here. You see that indeed. So it is the value that we see here on the screen. All right. Let me show you that we can call the map method on it, and then because the map method would be useful to now actually get the adjust the number, because you'll see that we also have here the euro sign. Okay, and we need to get rid of that, and so the map method would be perfect for that. So here let me just write console.log movements UI dot map of. So here you're using this el element, and then el dot text content dot replace. So here in replace, so I'm using here the euro symbol here, or else you can just grab it from the code previously. So here I'm just setting here this one into the empty. So when I save this, so when I just go ahead and just say JS, and of course it's not going to work because this one here is already a real array movements UI, this one. Okay, at this point we created this movements array using the array form, so of course it's gonna work already. So it would not work if we did directly on the results of the query selector all, but we can make this even better. Of course we need to convert to a number, convert this here into the number, and then let me just here add one more. Okay, so when I save it, but that's not the point here actually. So the point here is we can use the second argument of the array from a function here, which remember the mapping callback, and so basically we can simply put the entire callback right here at the second argument. So here we are going to do is, so we are going to bring this constant inside the label balance here. Okay, and then dot, and then here we'll just replace this here. So let me just remove this here, and then here we'll just remove this bracket, and then here we'll just paste it. Okay, now when we run this, so here it is not the dot, here it is the comma. So when we run this, see, when I just again simply log in, so when I click on this, yeah, here it is not the array not map, because we just removed the map and we just added here in our second argument here, right? So we don't require here the map. So when we run this, and then let me just log in here JS pin. See here when I click this here, see, we get the value here. So this movements UI array is the final array as we see it here, and as we click here we get the numbers. So here, as you see here, we got the numbers. So let's recap. So here we use the array.from to create an array from the result of the query selector all, which is the node list, which is not really an array, and an array like structure. And that array like structure can easily be converted to an array using the array.from. And as the second step, we even included the map function, which then forms that initial array that's exactly as we wanted. So basically converting the raw elements to its text content by replacing the euro sign with nothing. And so in the end we end up exactly with the array of numbers that we intended. By the way, I'm not sure if I mentioned it earlier, but there is another way of converting this here into an array as well. So let me just show you that. Here we could do by using the spread operator. So we'll just copy this line. So we'll just store this here in the constant UI2. So let me just console.log movements UI2. So when I run this, we could do in this way as well. So this creates an array, and then now we need to do the mapping separately. So actually I prefer this method than this one. So I don't use this method. Okay, so I'm just saying that we could also write in this method. Okay. To me, the array.from function was the great addition to JavaScript in the ES6. With this, we are complete with the methods and functions and that we learned about arrays. So in the next video, I'll help you to decide which array method you should learn in each situation to solve different problems. Okay, that's it for this video.